Welcome back. We're going to talk about India now. India is a crucial country to understand for a lot of reasons. But for one of the most important reasons for us, for a political science class, is that this is the largest in terms of population. It's the most populous democracy on the planet. So there are about 1.2 billion people living in India, and growing, of course. Around 700 plus million voters. It's the seventh largest state. That's a seventh largest state. So here you've got a map of India. It's also been a state that's been plagued with conflict, especially in the northern areas. India was born after World War II when it gained its independence from Britain. Part of its territory went to Pakistan, and you still have conflict areas. So this is actually an area that India claims, but it's actually ruled by Pakistan. This is an area over here that Pakistan claims, and it's ruled by India. So this is Kashmir. This is an area here that India claims, but it's ruled by China since 1962. This is part of northeast Kashmir. So lots of problems. In Kashmir, you've had an average of about 3,000 people dying in conflict per year up until the last few years, when things have been dying down. And you actually have an increase in tourism as of late. In terms of ethnic diversity, it's an incredibly diverse country. From a religious standpoint, about 80% of the people are Hindu, but you've got different variations of Hinduism. 12% are Muslims, 3% are Sikhs, 3% are Christians. The Aryans dominate in the north. The most common language is Hindi, and this is about 2/3 of the population up in the north. The Dravidians dominate in the south, are more prevalent, I should say, in the south, and they speak a dialect of Dravidian, and about a quarter of the population is linked to them. India represents the 12th largest economy in the world, but with respect to per capita income, it's pretty miserable at about 142nd in the entire world. So about $1,000 is the per capita income. In the 20th century, you had a major period of urbanization, where the urban population increased about 11 times, but it's still a country that's overwhelmingly rural. Nearly 3/4 or 7/10 of the population, 70% or so is rural. So a big question: what happens politically when populations urbanize? Well, we've seen this. We've seen this in lots of cases. You have demands for more. You've got more people organizing to make those demands. You've got parties that evolve to deal with these, to appeal to these groups, so they can actually give them more rights. Look back at the British experience. So this is important. India has a huge middle class, around 300 million people. It's also got, though, the largest concentration of poverty. They rank number 1 in terms of child malnutrition in the world, around 46%. Their literacy rates are pretty miserable. They're much lower than any of the other countries that we've looked at to date, around 65%. So China's, which I believe would have fallen next, is about 82%. So very low, relatively very low literacy rates. So we'll talk about the evolution of India. There's evidence of permanent settlements going as far back as 9,000 years ago. The nomads came from Persia to India around 3,000 years ago and forced many Dravidians south, and then they fused with others, creating a new culture of sorts. Hinduism is it's interesting. It's like Islam. It's involved in most aspects of life. There are traditions and norms around eating, dress, livelihood, social structure, in terms of the castes, which we'll talk about later, etc. So Hinduism took strong root in India, but also Buddhism was born in India. So we've got two really important religions that came right out of India. From 300 to 600 AD, people talk about the Golden Age of India. This was the Gupta dynasty, which consolidated control in northern India and gradually spread through south, and then through central and then southeast India, thanks to their very sophisticated military. This is a period of major advances in science, technology, engineering, art, literature, logic, math, astronomy, religion, philosophy, pretty much everything. Any department you're looking for. I didn't see political science there. And actually, it's not a big surprise. They ended in the 7th century with the invasions from Central Asia. At this point, we're talking about the Hunas. Um, and so here you've got a weakened kingdom, resources robbed. The Hunas take India province by province. Um, in the 8th century, you've got a new set of invaders, and these are Muslim invaders. And they come for trade, they come for diamonds, and they bring Islam. So this is important. They bring these Muslim invaders bring Islam down to India for the first time. Um, I'm sorry, for the second time, because really Islam had initially been brought by Muslim traders about a century earlier, in the 7th century. But now you've got invaders who bring it in, and they create a sort of blend of religions with Hinduism, which creates Sikhism. So a fundamentally new religion and another important religion in the world. Um, so skipping ahead, um, and here you've got a picture of Genghis Khan, and then on the left you've got a flag of the British East India Company, and these really are crucial to understanding the 16th and 19th centuries. From the 16th to the 18th century, we've got Mughal dominance. Again, the same invaders who went across Russia moved south, and they took over large parts of India. In the process, Persian literature and Persian culture spread towards India. So we refer to them as the Mughals. Mughals actually derived from the original homelands of the Timurids, the Central Asian steppes, which were once conquered by Genghis Khan, and hence known as Moghulstan, which means literally land of the Mongols. Early Mongols spoke a language known as the Chagatai language, and they maintained these Turco-Mongol practices. They were essentially Persianized. They transferred the Persian literature and Persian culture then to India, and this forms the base for the Indo-Persian culture that you see there. So during this period of Mughal invasion, of Mughal dominance, there is no strong centralized state. And this means that India is easy prey to invaders of all sorts, because remember how the Mughals run their country, their empires. They are an empire, so they don't have an on the ground presence. And so the Mughals are gradually replaced by the Europeans. The Europeans had actually been coming to India since the 16th century, thanks to these various trade routes that were set up. And the British set up the East India Company, which would have an enormous role in the future of India. It was set up and by the 1600s, it was focused first on trade. Think about what India had cotton, silk, tea, opium, right? There's that. But then gradually they saw India as a source of cheap labor, because remember, they had colonies all over the place. So the British East India Company said, hey, we can actually export some of these people. And they began to they came to eventually rule large swaths of India. And they exercised military power and actually assumed administrative functions here. So we can talk about the colonization of India really based on a company, the East India Company. And the commercial aspects eventually faded, and they set up various puppet governorships known as Nabobs, Nabob, which were really run by British merchant advisors under the guise of these authentic governorships. So the Brits imported a lot of things into India during this time. Notions of private property, the English language, of course, science, literature, and literacy, and in part a liberal political philosophy. Not to say that the Brits were particularly liberal there, but their liberal political philosophy would rub off. Before it did, you had a mutiny in the 19th century, caused by, not surprisingly, economic frustration. And it leads to the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 to 1858, where the Indian aristocracy essentially rebelled, but they were too divided to succeed. You had Hindus and Muslims who were very much polarized, and so the result was that in 1958, India came under direct colonial rule, with British civil servants replacing the merchant advisors. So the mutiny really leads to direct colonial rule by the British state rather than British rule through a proxy. This lack of unity lasts until the end of the 19th century, by the way. So the split between the Hindus and Muslims. And at that point, you've got an Indian National Congress and a Muslim League. So Muslims by then accounted for about 25% of the population. And the INC, the Indian National Congress, and the Muslim League come together and demand independence. And the picture that you see here is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a lawyer, he was a pacifist, extremely charismatic, and also the head of the INC, Indian National Congress. So talk of independence really increases dramatically after the end of World War II, because remember, everyone's talking about the states. Wilson, back after World War I, had initially talked about this the national self-determination, but now it really becomes something that's coming to fruition around the world. The problem is that Muslim and Hindu militants were clashing, and so the Brits decided that rather than give this big thing over to India, they were going to partition the state. And they did in 1947. And Pakistan, which includes what would later become Bangladesh, becomes a state for Muslims. And then India proper becomes a state for Hindus, supposedly. As I mentioned, though, it's very mixed. Now remember, this is an incredibly mixed population. Especially with the large Muslim population. And so what happens is you've got this enormous migration. You've got ethnic cleansing in a sense, where you've got, and probably not in a sense, probably through legal, by legal definition, ethnic cleansing. You've got millions of refugees. You've got violence. 1 million people are killed in this. So independent India is born with millions of displaced people. People who had left the Pakistani areas to come to India because they were Hindus, and then people who were trying to get out of the Hindu-dominated places to move to Pakistan. You've got an extremely poor population, an uneducated population, and a population that really, in some senses, lacks democratic institutions or liberal traditions. Now, what they did have, which was a positive aspect of the British legacy, was this notion of the rule of law. A parliamentary democracy, so these foreign institutions that were sort of dropped down. So they weren't their own democratic institutions, but they were something. And a constitutional government. You also had a very organized civil service and police force and military and legal system. Probably most importantly, you had a set of well-educated intellectuals who knew how to govern the state. They'd been in the bureaucracy under the Brits. And you also had a charismatic leadership under the INC. And with the Muslim League gone, national identity became much easier to build. So let me just check time here. I'm going to stop here. We'll talk about independent India in a separate slide.